Nearly half of this country has been living under a heat warning at the same time, and it has now become the single deadliest weather event in the United States this year. Right now, as of late July 2026, the heat that settled over the country in the last days of June has not fully let go, and the human toll it left behind is still being counted. Let me give you the scale because the numbers matter here. At the peak of this event, close to 180 million Americans, more than half the population, were under a major or extreme heat risk on the same day. The National Weather Service described the conditions at many locations as exceptionally rare, even for the middle of July. This was not a hot afternoon. This was a wall of heat that sat on top of the country for the better part of 3 weeks and refused to move. To understand why this one was so dangerous, you have to understand the shape of it, because this was not one heat wave, it was two, back to back. What drove both was a heat dome. A heat dome is a ridge of high pressure that parks over a region and acts like a lid on a pot. It traps warm air underneath, it presses that air downward, and as the air sinks it compresses and heats up further. The sky goes clear, the sun pours in day after day, and there is nothing to break the pattern. The heat does not pass through. It builds. The first dome formed over the eastern United States in the final days of June and held through the 4th of July. As that one finally weakened, a second dome built over the west and the plains and pushed temperatures back into the triple digits from Utah to Montana. The country barely got a day to breathe between them. Now let me give you the records, because this is where the severity stops being abstract. Phoenix, Arizona hit 113 degrees. Billings, Montana reached 111. And on July 12th, Salt Lake City, Utah recorded 109 degrees, an all-time high for that city. Not a July record, an all-time record, in a city that has been keeping temperature records for more than a century. Then look at the East Coast, because this is the part that should stop you. Atlantic City, New Jersey reached 106 degrees on the 4th of July. Philadelphia hit 103. Boston touched 101. These are not desert cities. These are dense, humid, coastal, northern places, built for a cooler climate than the one they are now sitting in. When Atlantic City is hotter than the surface of a parking lot in Phoenix normally is, the map has stopped making sense. And the raw temperature is only half the danger. The other half is humidity, and the reason it matters is simple biology. Your body cools itself by sweating. When sweat evaporates off your skin, it carries heat away with it. But when the air is already saturated with moisture, the sweat cannot evaporate. It just sits on you. Your primary cooling system stops working at the exact moment you need it most. That is why forecasters watch the heat index, the combined effect of temperature and humidity, and during this event the heat index in parts of the Mississippi Valley and the Northeast pushed well past 110 degrees. But here is the detail that does the real killing, and almost nobody talks about it. The nights did not cool down. Normally night is when your body recovers, when the air drops and the house releases its heat. During this event, overnight lows in many cities stayed in the high 70s and low 80s. When it never cools down, the heat stress never resets. It accumulates hour after hour, day after day, and that is what pushes a vulnerable body over the edge. This is the part that stops being about the weather and starts being about people. Heat is the deadliest form of extreme weather in the United States. In an average year, it kills more Americans than hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods combined. It does not tear roofs off houses, so it does not lead the news the way a storm does. But it kills more people, and this event proved it again. By the 8th of July, at least 44 deaths had been linked to the heat. The state hit hardest was New Jersey, with 29 deaths. Pennsylvania recorded 7, Illinois 4, New York 3, and Mississippi 1. 44 people in the first stretch of the event alone. And that is an early count, which is the important thing to understand. Heat deaths are chronically undercounted. When heat pushes a weak heart into failure, the death certificate often says heart attack. When it pushes failing kidneys over the edge, it says organ failure. The heat is the trigger, but it rarely gets named. Studies that go back and reconstruct the real toll routinely find numbers several times higher than the official count. So let me explain what heat actually does to a body, because once you understand the mechanism, you understand who is at risk. Your body has one job in a heat wave, and that is to hold your core temperature near 98.6 degrees. It does that by pushing blood to the surface of your skin and by sweating. Both of those cost you. Pushing blood to the skin means your heart has to work harder and beat faster, which is dangerous if your heart is already weak. Sweating means you lose water and salt, which thickens your blood and strains your kidneys. When the heat wins, your core temperature starts to climb. Above 104 degrees internally, you are in heat stroke. Your proteins begin to break down. Your organs begin to fail in sequence, and it can happen in hours. This is why the Centers for Disease Control reported that heat-related emergency room visits reached, in their words, extremely high levels across multiple regions during this event. Those emergency rooms were not full of people who did something reckless. They were full of ordinary people whose cooling system was simply overwhelmed. And that burden is not distributed evenly. It never is. The Americans who absorb the most of this are older adults, People with heart, lung, and kidney conditions, pregnant women, young children, outdoor workers, and households without reliable air conditioning. Air conditioning is the single most effective protection against heat death that exists, and access to it splits almost perfectly along the lines of income. Think about who cannot escape this. A construction worker or a farm laborer cannot step inside at 2 in the afternoon because the job is outside and the paycheck depends on finishing it. A warehouse worker in a building with no cooling breathes that same heat for a full shift. An elderly resident on a fixed income may have an air conditioner sitting in the window and still not turn it on because they are afraid of the electricity bill. That is not a rare story. That is a common one, and it is a quiet killer. During heat events, a disproportionate share of the people who die are found alone, indoors, in homes that were simply too hot. And that brings us directly to the next impact, because the same heat that threatens those people was straining the one system meant to protect them. Now the power grid, because this is the impact that almost went catastrophically wrong. The grid operator known as PJM manages electricity for 67 million people across 13 states and Washington, D.C., from New Jersey out to Illinois. During this heat wave, PJM watched demand climb toward 165 gigawatts, approaching the all-time record it set back in 2006. Think about what that number represents. It is tens of millions of air conditioners in the eastern half of the country switching on at the same time, all day, for days on end, and refusing to switch off at night because the night never cooled. The grid was pushed to the edge of what it can physically deliver. And when a grid gets pushed that far, the danger is a feedback loop from hell. The heat drives demand, the demand strains the equipment, the strained equipment fails, and the failure cuts the cooling at the exact moment people need it to survive. You can see that strain most clearly in the price of electricity, because a power market does not hide fear, it prints it. On the worst evening of the heat wave, the wholesale price of electricity in the PJM region surged past $1,600 per megawatt hour. Earlier that same day, it had been under $40. That is a 40-fold jump in a matter of hours. That is the market screaming that supply and demand had very nearly crossed. And then the storms came, as they often do when a heat dome finally breaks. Across the 4th of July weekend, more than 1.3 million power outages were reported. In New Jersey alone, 250,000 customers lost power on July 3rd, at the exact moment the heat index was at its most dangerous. Losing power in a blizzard is frightening. Losing power in a heat wave, when your air conditioning is the only thing keeping the inside of your home survivable, can be fatal. That is the worst possible time to go dark, and that is precisely when it happened. Now let's follow the heat out of the city and into the fields, because this is the impact that reaches your grocery bill whether or not the heat ever touched your street. Extreme heat is brutal on agriculture. Crops have a temperature ceiling, and above it they stop growing and start protecting themselves. Corn and soybeans across the Midwest hit during their most sensitive weeks can suffer what agronomists call heat stress, where pollination fails and yields drop. Dairy cows produce less milk when they are heat stressed. Cattle and feedlots can die in large numbers during a severe event. Every one of those effects is a supply shock, and supply shocks show up later as higher prices at the checkout. Then there is the labor cost, which is enormous and almost invisible. When it is 105 degrees, a roofing crew, a road crew, a landscaping team, a warehouse of workers, all of them slow down because a human being physically cannot maintain the same pace in that heat without collapsing. Multiply that lost productivity across every outdoor and un-air-conditioned workplace in the country across weeks, and you are looking at one of the largest hidden costs of a heat wave. So let's add it up, because this reaches every American whether the heat touched your state or not. Extreme heat is not just a health event. It is an economic one, and a large one. It cuts worker productivity across entire industries. It damages crops in the field and livestock in the barn. It strains and sometimes breaks the energy system, driving up the price of the power everyone buys. It fills emergency rooms and hospital beds, and someone pays for that care. Independent analysis has put the annual cost of extreme heat to the United States economy in the range of $160 billion through lost labor, agricultural damage, and healthcare. Every one of those triple-digit days carries a bill, and it is paid in wages, in food prices, in insurance premiums, and in emergency room visits, spread quietly across the whole country. And here is the part worth sitting with. This is not an outlier anymore. Scientists who studied this specific event concluded that a heat wave of this intensity would have been virtually impossible without the warming already built into the climate. What used to be a once-in-a-generation summer is now arriving every few years. And the infrastructure underneath us, the grid, the hospitals, the housing, the water systems, was designed and built for a cooler country than the one we now live in. We are running a hotter climate on cooler climate machinery, and the gap between the two is exactly where people get hurt. So when you hear that a heat wave is coming, understand what that actually means. It is the most dangerous weather in America, arriving quietly, with no wind and no rain to photograph. It kills the most vulnerable first. It pushes the power grid to its limit. It reaches into the fields that grow your food, and it sends a bill to everyone. The smoke clears and the floodwater drains, but heat leaves almost nothing behind to show a camera. That is exactly why it is so easy to underestimate, and exactly why it kills more Americans than anything else in the sky. So take the next one seriously. Learn the warning signs of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Drink water before you are thirsty. Find air conditioning, even for a few hours a day, wherever you can. And check on the people around you who can't. The elderly neighbor, the person working outside, the family with no cooling. In a heat wave, that phone call or that knock on the door is not a small thing. It is, very often, the difference.